The dim winter light barely shone through the tall windows of the crematorium. Gwendolyn Tate habitually adjusted her dark blue uniform and sat down at the reception desk. Her workday was just beginning. The ancient red brick building kept a special silence, which had long since become familiar to her. A man appeared in the reception area, tall, statuesque, in an impeccably fitting gray suit. He stopped at the counter, and Gwendolyn noted that his eyes were red, a sure sign of recent tears. "Good morning. I would like to arrange a cremation for my aunt." His voice sounded soft, with a slight hoarseness. "My condolences." Gwendolyn pulled out a file folder. "My name is Gwendolyn. I'll help you with all the formalities." "Warren Tate," the man introduced himself, taking a seat in the chair opposite. He smelled of expensive perfume and coffee. They spent the next hour filling out paperwork. Warren told about his aunt, Martha Collins, a single woman who replaced his mother. Gwendolyn listened, noting how warmly he spoke of the deceased, how sincerely grieved. It was rare to find such relatives in their line of work. Most were in a hurry to get the formalities over with as soon as possible. "You know, Miss," Warren began. "Just Gwendolyn," she corrected gently. "Gwendolyn. This is going to sound strange, but it's surprisingly peaceful here. I thought it would be different." She nodded understandingly. "A lot of people say that. This place isn't about death, Mr. Tate. It's about memory and respect." Their gazes met, and Gwendolyn felt a blush flood her cheeks. She hastily lowered her eyes to the papers. In the following days, Warren appeared at the crematorium several more times. It was necessary to settle the details of the ceremony, to pick up the urn. Each of his visits dragged on. He asked Gwendolyn about her work, told stories from the life of his aunt, shared memories. One day, he brought 2 cups of coffee. "I noticed you don't have a coffee machine here. And a morning without coffee isn't a morning." That simple gesture touched Gwendolyn. Warren was attentive to detail, a good listener. He worked as an insurance agent, and in his stories, life was a wonderful kaleidoscope of fates. When the formalities were complete, Warren suddenly suggested, "You know, I'd like to thank you for your help and your participation. May I take you to dinner?" Gwendolyn hesitated. In their field, it was not customary to socialize with clients outside of work, but something in his gaze, open, sincere, made her agree. Their first dinner was at a small Italian restaurant. Warren talked about his work, about traveling, about books. Gwendolyn caught herself thinking that she hadn't felt so at ease with someone in a long time. "You know," he said as he walked her home, "when I first came to the crematorium, I was heartbroken. But I met you, and this is going to sound strange, but you showed me that life goes on." Gwendolyn smiled. "My job is all about remembering that we're not dealing with death, but with people, with their feelings." "You're amazing," Warren said quietly, and took her hand for the first time. It was an early spring that year. They met almost every day, walking in the park, going to the movies, just talking. Warren knew how to turn an ordinary evening into a special one. He would bring a rare book or suggest a spontaneous trip out of town. Her colleague, Harold Pierce, shook his head. "Look, Gwen, not so often in our kingdom of the dead happen love stories." But Gwendolyn couldn't stop now. For the first time in 32 years, she felt truly alive. The wedding took place on the first day of fall. Gwendolyn insisted on a modest ceremony, only close friends and colleagues. Warren supported her choice, although he admitted that he dreamed of a lavish celebration. Harold Pierce, who over the past months has witnessed their romance, volunteered to be best man. He gave a touching toast. "In 7 years of work, this is the first time I've seen Gwendolyn so happy. They say that in our profession it is difficult to keep faith in life, but love always finds a way." They spent their honeymoon in a small town on the coast. Warren rented a cozy house overlooking the ocean. In the mornings, they drank coffee on the veranda, watching the seagulls. In the afternoons, they walked along the shore, and in the evenings, Warren read aloud to her. He turned out to be an excellent reader. "You know," said Gwendolyn one day, "I never thought it was possible to be so happy." Warren put his arm around her. "You deserve all the best. I thank fate every day for meeting you." After their return, they settled into a spacious apartment downtown. Warren insisted that Gwendolyn leave her job at the crematorium. "You've been around death for too long. It's time to enjoy life. But she refused. It's not just a job, honey. I'm helping people through the toughest moments of their lives. He didn't insist, only smiled. That's one of the reasons I love you. You know how to see the light even in the darkness. Their first year of marriage seemed perfect. On weekends, they had home-cooked dinners where Harold was often invited. Warren talked a lot about his work. He was one of the best insurance agents in the company. He was valued for his ability to find an approach to customers. In Warren's office worked Ursula Black, an energetic woman who quickly became friends with Gwendolyn. They often met for lunch, and Ursula admired their marriage. You and Warren, like characters in a romantic movie, he takes such touching care of you. Indeed, Warren did not miss an opportunity to please his wife. He brought her favorite flowers, or cooked dinner, or arranged a surprise in the form of theater tickets. He remembered all the important dates, including the day they first met. One evening, as they sat in the parlor, Gwendolyn asked, "Don't you think it's strange that we met exactly there at the crematorium?" Warren looked at her thoughtfully. "You know, my aunt always said that true love can begin anywhere. The important thing is to be able to see it." There was always music in their house. Warren turned out to be a great connoisseur of jazz. In the evenings, they danced to old records, and Gwendolyn felt like the heroine of a romantic story. Even at work, she seemed to glow from within. Harold often joked, "You are so radiant that our clients begin to believe in life after death." Every day, Gwendolyn woke up thinking how lucky she was. Warren was the perfect husband, attentive, caring, understanding. He supported all her decisions, was interested in her opinion, shared his plans and dreams. They made plans for the future, dreamed of their own home, thought about children. Warren often talked about how great it would be to hold a baby in his arms one day. "Just imagine," he said, "he'll have your eyes and your kindness." Everything in their lives seemed right and harmonious. Every night, falling asleep next to her husband, Gwendolyn thought that finally found his place in life, his true happiness. Changes began so imperceptibly that Gwendolyn did not immediately pay attention to them. At first it was small things. Warren began to call less often in the middle of the day, stopped bringing occasional gifts, more and more often delayed at work. "Big project, honey," he'd explain, coming home after dark. He smelled like cigarettes, even though he'd quit smoking before they were married. Their dinners turned into silent devouring of food. Warren was constantly checking his phone, answering messages. "Sorry, it's important," he'd say without lifting his eyes from the screen. One morning, Gwendolyn found a restaurant receipt in his jacket pocket. An expensive dinner for two, wine, desserts. The date was the same night he'd said he'd be late for a meeting. She put the check back, convincing herself it was a business meeting. At work, Gwendolyn became distracted. Harold noticed the change in her mood. "Is everything okay? You've been kind of lost lately." "I'm fine," she smiled. "Just tired a little." Their weekends were no longer filled with plans together. Warren talked more and more about urgent matters, about client meetings. Now he rarely stayed home on Saturdays, and on Sunday he slept in until lunchtime. Ursula had changed too. She came to their traditional lunches less often, and when she did, she seemed nervous and avoided talking about Warren. "You know, it's a hot time in the insurance business," she once said, hurriedly finishing her coffee. "Everybody's really busy." In the evenings, lying in bed, Gwendolyn thought back to their first year together. Where had gone those long conversations, walks together, spontaneous trips out of town? Now Warren often sat in the living room late into the night, ostensibly working on documents. There were new shirts in his closet. She hadn't bought them. The collars smelled of unfamiliar perfume. The laundry must have changed the fabric conditioner, Gwendolyn thought, trying to drown out her growing anxiety. Their physical intimacy had changed too. Warren increasingly said he was tired or that he had a headache. His kisses became hurried, as if an obligatory formality. On their second wedding anniversary, he gave her an expensive bracelet. "I'm sorry I've been working a lot lately," he said. "Things will get better soon." But things weren't getting better. Now he could stay away from home for 2 days, explaining it with business trips. Called rarely, spoke short and dry. Gwendolyn began to notice how often he smiles, looking at the phone. How hides the screen when she passes by, how carefully he deleted his call and message history. One night she asked, "Do you still love me?" Warren looked at her in surprise. "Of course I do, dear. It's just a difficult time at work right now. You understand, don't you?" She nodded, but the feeling of emptiness inside only intensified. At the crematorium, Gwendolyn often thought about how strangely life worked. Every day she helped people say goodbye to their loved ones, and now she herself was slowly saying goodbye to her happiness. "Maybe I think about it too much?" she asked herself, looking at another bouquet of flowers Warren had forgotten to take home from work. But her intuition told her something was wrong. Something irrevocably changed in their relationship, as if love slowly cooled, turning into ashes. That day, Gwendolyn decided to prepare a special dinner. She bought Warren's favorite wine, fresh produce, spices. I wanted to return that feeling of celebration, which used to arise simply from spending time together. She called her husband's office, but an unfamiliar girl answered the phone. "Mr. Tate is in a meeting with a client. Can I take a message?" "No, thank you. Is Ursula there?" "Miss Black is also absent. She has a meeting with a client." Gwendolyn hung up. Something in that answer scratched her attention, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Dinner was getting cold on the table. The clock showed 10 p.m. when Warren finally called. "Sorry, darling, don't expect you tonight. Urgent trip to a client in the suburbs." His voice carried the noise of the restaurant, the clinking of glasses, the muffled music. Gwendolyn silently turned off the phone. The next day, she decided to stop by his office with a home-cooked lunch. It used to be their little tradition. As she parked outside the building, she saw Warren coming out of the main entrance. Ursula was walking next to him. They were talking animatedly about something, and suddenly Warren put his hand on her waist in that familiar, intimate gesture. Gwendolyn froze in the car, unable to move. They got into his car and drove away without noticing her. Back at the crematorium, she mechanically did her work. Harold asked several times if everything was all right, but she only nodded in response. In the evening, while sorting out laundry for washing, Gwendolyn found a note in Warren's shirt pocket. "Meet me there at 8. You." The handwriting was feminine, hurried. She pulled out her husband's cell phone while he slept. For the past few months, the same number, no name, just numbers, had regularly appeared in the call list. The messages had been deleted. Strange notations had appeared in his day planner, the initials WB and meeting times. Ursula Black. How could she have been so blind? A lot of things made sense now. Late returns, business trips, business dinners, new shirts and the smell of other people's perfume, silent evenings and aloofness in bed. One morning she met Ursula at the supermarket. She looked confused. "Gwendolyn? Yeah, I didn't expect to see you here." "Yes, me too," Gwendolyn replied, looking at the expensive necklace around her former friend's neck. It was the exact same one she had seen in an advertising catalog Warren had recently leafed through. Ursula hurriedly said goodbye, leaving the unfinished groceries in the cart. Gwendolyn looked after her, feeling a cold emptiness growing inside. At home, she began to notice new details. How Warren hides his phone when she enters the room. How diligently he deletes the browser history on his computer. How he avoids looking her in the eye. "Why don't we go out tonight?" she suggested over breakfast. "Sorry, important meeting today," he replied without looking away from his phone. "With Ursula?" The question popped out on its own. Warren froze for a second, but immediately replied calmly. "What's the big deal? We're having a corporate event." She drove past the office that evening. The building was dark, no event, and Warren's car was parked outside a restaurant 2 blocks away. Gwendolyn didn't bother to go inside. She just sat in the car, looking at the glowing windows of the restaurant, and thought about how strangely life worked. Every day she helped people say goodbye to the dead, but no one had taught her how to say goodbye to a dying love. That night she couldn't sleep for a long time, listening to the steady breathing of her husband sleeping next to her. The man she seemed to know best in the world, and who suddenly became a complete stranger. That evening the rain drummed on the eaves of their house. Gwendolyn had returned from work earlier than usual. The last ceremony had been canceled. Warren's shoes were in the hallway. He was home, too, though he was supposed to be at a conference in another city. As she walked up the stairs, She heard his voice from his office. "Sure, I missed you." "No, she's at work." "Yes, I miss you too." The phone conversation cut off as Gwendolyn opened the door. Warren turned around abruptly, his face contorted with fright for a moment. "You're early," was all he said. "Aren't you supposed to be at the conference?" "Canceled at the last minute." Gwendolyn walked slowly to his desk. "And you decided not to let me know about it?" "I was going to." He tried to block the laptop screen, but it was too late. She'd already seen the booking page open 2 tickets to a resort, a suite for next weekend, in the names of Warren Tate and Ursula Black. "I can explain," he began. "Really?" Her voice sounded unexpectedly calm. "And how long has this been going on?" Warren stood up, trying to take her hand. "Gwen, listen. Don't touch me," she recoiled. "How long? A month? 6 months? It's complicated." Complicated? Her composure began to crack. Was it hard to lie to me every day? Was it hard to sleep with her and then come back to our bed? "I didn't mean to hurt you." "Didn't mean to hurt you?" She was almost screaming. "How did you think you were going to do that? Sneak off to a resort with her?" He tried to hug her. "Let's talk calmly." "Calmly?" Gwendolyn pushed him away. "You're fucking my friend and you want to talk calmly?" Warren backed toward the stairs. "You're not yourself right now. Let's discuss this later." "Later? When you get back from your romantic trip?" She grabbed the first thing she could get her hands on, a heavy glass vase, and hurled it at him. Warren recoiled, lost his balance on the top step. His fall seemed endless. A muffled thump. Silence. Gwendolyn slowly descended the stairs. Warren lay with his neck unnaturally twisted, a thin trickle of blood oozing from his ear. She knelt beside him, felt for a pulse. Faint, barely perceptible. She dialed 911 in a panic, but when the dispatcher answered, images flashed before her eyes. Warren and Ursula together, their plans, their future, his months-long lies. He would get away with it again, lie again, continue to ruin her life. Gwendolyn hung up the phone without saying a word. Images flashed before her eyes. Tickets to the resort, secret meetings, lies months long. Her fingers unclenched. The phone fell to the carpet. The pulse under her fingers grew fainter and fainter. She'd worked at the crematorium long enough to know she had an hour at most, an hour to make a decision that would change everything. The rain outside the window intensified, making this October evening the perfect backdrop for the tragedy that was unfolding in their home. Gwendolyn looked at her watch. There was no one in the crematorium now. It would only take her a few hours to finish everything. Forever. She stood up, wiped away her tears. Her hands no longer trembled. The drive to the crematorium took 15 minutes. In the trunk, wrapped in plaid, lay Warren's body. Gwendolyn drove slowly, obeying all the rules, just so as not to attract the attention of the occasional patrol. The building was empty and dark. She knew that the security cameras were turned off at 7 in the evening, saving the budget. Gwendolyn opened the service entrance with her key, turned on the minimal lights. 7 years working here. She knew every corner, every procedure. Warren's body was unexpectedly heavy. Gwendolyn handled it herself, although usually this work was done by 2 employees. While the oven heated up, she sat in her office, staring into the darkness outside the window. Her hands were icy cold. Her head felt strangely empty. She felt no fear, no remorse, only numbness. The cremation process took several hours. All this time, Gwendolyn sat motionless, looking at the rising temperature figures, 1,000 degrees, 2,000. The process is irreversible. In the morning, she called the police. "My husband did not come home. He left yesterday morning for a conference and is not answering his cell phone." An hour later, she was already giving her statement to the detective. She spoke calmly, held herself with confidence, the right words, the natural concern in her voice. "He was supposed to be back this morning. There's no answer on his cell phone. I'm very worried." In the evening, Ursula sent a message. "Where's Warren? Why isn't he picking up the phone?" Gwendolyn didn't answer. She methodically cleaned all traces of their last meeting, cleaned the floor on the stairs, threw away the broken vase, scrubbed the barely visible bloodstains from the carpet. She showed up at work the next day. Harold noticed her condition. "What's wrong? You look pale." "Warren's missing." Her voice shook just enough to seem sincere. "The police are looking." After calling the police, Gwendolyn drove out of town, picked a deserted spot on the highway where cars whizzed by at high speed, and left Warren's wallet, his phone, and his watch there. Scattered the items as if they'd been thrown from a passing car. The next day, an anonymous tipster reported the items to police. Investigators combed the area, but found nothing but Warren's personal belongings. The version about an accident on the road became the main one. Gwendolyn cried on camera, interviewed on local news. "Please help me find my husband." Her grief seemed real. She was indeed mourning their love, but not his death. Ursula avoided seeing her, only calling once. "I need to tell you something." "I'm sorry. I can't talk right now." Gwendolyn cut her off. At night, she woke up from nightmares. She dreamed of Warren opening his eyes on the table in the crematorium as reaching for her bloody hands. But in the morning, the fear receded, replaced by cold determination. A month passed. The police hadn't found the body. All the evidence pointed to an accident somewhere on the highway. The case was gradually coming to a dead end. Gwendolyn continued to work, accept condolences, play the role of the inconsolable widow. Only sometimes, alone, she went to the furnace and touched the cool metal. Somewhere here, within these walls, the last traces of her marriage, her love, her former life had disappeared. Detective Truman Holt finished reading the anonymous letter and flipped through Warren Tate's case file for the third time. Something wasn't adding up in this story from the beginning. The letter contained several odd details about the fact that Warren couldn't have gone to the conference because it had been canceled a week before his disappearance. About the fact that he had been spotted in town the day he disappeared, and that he was having an affair with a co-worker. Holt started by checking the conference schedule. Indeed, the event was canceled 10 days before the proposed date. Gwendolyn Tate claimed that's where her husband went. The next step was a visit to the insurance company. Ursula Black looked startled when the detective asked to see her. Mr. Tate was a very special man. She nervously rubbed her handkerchief. We were close, very close. He was supposed to meet me that day, but he didn't show up. It wasn't like him. Why didn't you report it sooner? I was afraid and ashamed. Gwendolyn was my friend. Holt checked the security cameras in the neighborhood of the Tate house. The footage showed Warren coming home in the evening. 2 hours later, Gwendolyn's car pulls out of the garage. The quality of the recording did not allow to see if someone was in the passenger seat. At the crematorium where Gwendolyn worked, the detective discovered that the furnace was running the night Warren disappeared. This was unusual. All the procedures were usually done in the daytime. Sometimes there are urgent cases, explained Director Harold Pierce. Gwendolyn had access to the equipment. Holt interviewed neighbors. One elderly woman recalled a loud argument in the Tate home that evening. Someone was yelling, something broke, then it got quiet. The forensic results of Warren's recovered belongings showed an oddity. They showed no signs of having been outdoors for long. It was as if they had been planted shortly before discovery. Gwendolyn kept calm during the re-interrogation. I already told you, he was away at a conference. I didn't know it was canceled. We were going through a difficult period. Were you aware of his relationship with Miss Black? A pause. No, I didn't know. Holt noticed her fingers trembling, clutching the cup of water. The detective pieced together the facts. The canceled conference, the secret affair, the crematorium's nighttime operation, the hastily planted evidence. A picture was beginning to emerge, but hard evidence was needed to bring charges. She's cold-blooded, Holt told his partner. If it's her, she's thought this through. She just couldn't have done it. Harold Pierce sat in Detective Holt's office for the second hour. I've known Gwendolyn for 7 years. She's incapable of hurting even a fly. Holt spread out the photos in front of him. The happy couple at their wedding, family celebrations, vacations by the sea. Tell me again how she behaved in the last months before her husband disappeared. Was depressed, distracted. But that's natural. Their marriage had fallen on hard times. How do you know about the problems in their marriage? Harold was silent for a moment. She never complained directly, just stopped smiling when she talked about her husband. The Tate's neighbor, Mrs. Parker, entered the study next. I heard screaming that night, male and female voices. Then something crashed and there was silence. What time was that? About 8 o'clock. I was just watching my favorite show. Did you see anyone leave the house? Later I noticed Gwendolyn's car pulling out, but it was already dark. Ursula Black was nervous during the interrogation. Warren said he wanted a divorce, planned to talk to Gwendolyn after he returned from the conference. Which was canceled, Holt clarified. Yes, I found out about it later. Why didn't you make your relationship known sooner? I was afraid, and I was ashamed in front of Gwendolyn. Holt called the crematorium workers in for questioning. No one remembered the furnace being turned on at night. Only the night watchman confirmed that he had seen lights in the administration building. Miss Tate sometimes stayed late with paperwork, he explained. Gwendolyn held herself confidently during another interrogation. Yes, we had a fight before he left. I found out about the affair, but he left on his own, in his car. Which was never found, Holt remarked. I don't know what happened to the car. Her voice remained steady. Harold tried to vindicate her at every opportunity. We had an unscheduled cremation that night. I gave the order myself. Where's the paperwork? Lost in the office move. Holt sensed that everyone was not telling him something. Harold was clearly lying, trying to protect Gwendolyn. Ursula seemed to know more than she was telling, and Gwendolyn herself. There was not a single mistake in her testimony, too perfect for someone telling the truth. We still don't have a body, Holt was reminded by his superior. Without one, it's all just guesswork. But the detective couldn't stop now. He felt the clue was somewhere near. It was only necessary to find the last piece of the puzzle. The epiphany came to Holt when he was looking through the surveillance tapes from the parking lot of the crematorium for the 100th time. His attention was drawn to an ambulance that had driven by that night. He requested the ambulance's call log. At around 10 p.m., a call came in from the Tate's address. The caller canceled the call almost immediately, but the crew drove the specified route anyway, standard screening procedure for canceled calls. Someone dialed 9111, Holt told his partner. Started to talk about a fallen person, but cut the call short. Dispatch flagged a female voice. That was the first real lead. Holt pulled up the phone records. An emergency number had indeed been dialed from the Tate's home phone that evening. The detective again questioned the paramedics working that shift. Yes, we drove by the house, the paramedic confirmed. But the lights were off, no one came out. And half an hour later, cameras caught Gwendolyn's car entering the crematorium grounds. Why didn't you call an ambulance that night? Holt asked the next time he met Gwendolyn. I don't know what you mean. We have a recording of the call. It was your voice. Gwendolyn turned pale but quickly pulled herself together. I don't remember such a call. Holt began to compare times. Call to the ambulance, 10 o'clock at night. Canceling the call, a minute later. Gwendolyn's car at the crematorium, 11:15. He requested data from CCTV cameras within a 5-mile radius of the crematorium. Gwendolyn's car flashed on one of the recordings. The silhouette in the passenger seat could be discerned in the headlights. Check the thermal imaging footage, Holt ordered. The results were decisive. The infrared cameras recorded 2 heat sources in Gwendolyn's car, one behind the wheel and one in the passenger seat. The human body, still retaining heat. When the technical expert of the crematorium studied the logs of the furnace that night, he noted an oddity. The temperature rose too quickly. That's what happens when the object of cremation is still retaining its own heat. All the details came together. The fall, trying to call an ambulance, panic, decision to cover your tracks. You had only hours, Holt said quietly, looking at Gwendolyn. You couldn't wait until morning, because in the morning it would have been too late. She was silent, staring at one point in front of her. He was still alive, wasn't he? When you brought him to the crematorium, he was alive. There was silence in the courtroom. The jury was preparing to announce the verdict. Gwendolyn Tate sat motionless, staring straight ahead. For 2 weeks of the trial, she seemed to have aged 10 years, shriveled, pale, eyes sunken. Prosecutor Meyer made a brilliant accusatory speech. He presented the court with a chronology of events that left no doubt about the guilt of the defendant. The recording of the emergency call lasted only 15 seconds. Heavy breathing, the beginning of a sentence cut off at half a word. Expert phonoscopists confirmed the voice belonged to Gwendolyn. Surveillance cameras recorded her car at the crematorium that night. Neighbors heard the argument and the sound of the fall. The technicians confirmed that the furnace was working at an irregular time, but the strongest evidence was Gwendolyn's own testimony. "I didn't plan to kill him." Her voice sounded muffled in the hushed hall. "When he fell, I panicked, started to call an ambulance. But then I remembered everything. His lies, his betrayal. In that moment, I decided enough was enough. He's not going to run my life anymore." She talked about that night, about finding tickets to the resort, about talking to her lover on the phone, about the dropped vase and the fatal fall, about dragging a heavy body up the stairs, driving a car through empty streets, turning on the stove with trembling hands. The defense was built on the defendant's emotional state. The lawyer spoke of a state of affect, of prolonged psychological pressure, of the trauma of betrayal, of the spontaneous nature of the crime. He emphasized Gwendolyn's impeccable reputation, her charitable work, assistance to the families of the victims. Psychiatric examination confirmed, at the time of the crime, Gwendolyn was in a state of severe mental agitation. Experts noted signs of severe depression developed in the months before the tragedy. Ursula Black testified with tears in her eyes. She looked young and lost in her black suit. She told about their affair with Warren, about plans for the future, about how he was going to leave his wife, about how he loved expensive restaurants and spontaneous travel, about his smile and his voice, about the last conversation. Harold Pierce, testifying, nervously rubbed his tie. He defended Gwendolyn to the last. She was the best employee, attentive, sensitive, caring. What happened was a monstrous accident. I don't believe she could have planned a murder in cold blood. On cross-examination, the prosecutor forced him to admit he did not order the unscheduled cremation that night. His attempt to protect Gwendolyn turned against her. Detective Holt was the last witness for the prosecution. He methodically outlined all the details of the investigation, not missing a single detail, told how step by step he reconstructed the events of that night, how insignificant details were added to the big picture, how the call to the rescue service became the key to the solution. In the last word, Gwendolyn did not ask for leniency. She spoke of love and betrayal, of pain and rage, of decisions that cannot be undone, about how one moment can redraw a whole life. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. There was an oppressive silence in the room. Ursula cried silently in the last row. Harold walked nervously down the hall. Holt sat motionless, staring at one point. When the jury returned, the foreman held up the verdict sheet. His voice trembled. "Find the defendant Gwendolyn Tate guilty of manslaughter in the 2nd degree." The judge announced the sentence: 15 years in prison with parole eligibility after 10 years. Muffled sobs were heard in the hall. As Gwendolyn was being led away from the courtroom, she paused next to Ursula for a moment. "You know," she said quietly, "the worst part isn't that I killed him. The worst part is that I still love him." That night, Detective Holt sat in his office for a long time, looking at pictures of the happy couple. Somewhere between love and hate, between loyalty and betrayal, this tragedy happened. And no one, not the court, not the jury, not he himself, could say for sure whether it could have been prevented. A few weeks later, the crematorium got a new director. Harold resigned. Ursula quit her job at the insurance company and left town, and Gwendolyn began counting down the days of her incarceration, waking each night from the same nightmare, the sound of a falling body and an unreturned call to the emergency services.